Hi everyone, Hongbro here. This is a video going over how to perform RNG manipulations done in speedruns of Gen 1 Pokemon games. Being able to manipulate the RNG is very useful, and we use it in a few key locations to improve consistency and reduce variance in the runs. The main manipulations we do are manipulating a Nidoran male with near perfect stats to use as our main, manipulating a Pidgey encounter catch to use as our flyer, manipulating no encounters in Mount Moon, and manipulating the trash can puzzle in Surge's Gym in red only. This video is not going to cover any of these manips individually. Instead, this video will explain the fundamentals of how to perform RNG manipulations that will be applicable to all of them. The first thing I want to mention when talking about manipulating the RNG in Gen 1 is that the RNG advances very quickly. RNG advances every frame and can even advance more than once per frame depending on the situation. And because of just how fast the RNG advances, attempts to manipulate RNG for precise outcomes are very sensitive to execution errors and must be performed perfectly in order to match the result of a design manip. For example, even something as simple as walking up and then right instead of right and then up for a manip path can lead to different RNG and the manip could fail. Here's a simplified overview of how RNG manips work in Gen 1. RNG will always reset back to a consistent point when we hard restart the console. We can think of this as resetting back to 0. From here, if we play perfectly and precisely, we can advance the RNG the exact same way as a design manipulation in order to get favorable outcomes. In other words, after a hard restart, if we don't play frame perfectly, the manip will fail. A hard restart is when we turn the console off and on, or press the hard reset keybind in Ganbatte Speedrun, currently the only emulator allowed on the leaderboard. On the other hand, a soft reset, which is pressing A, B, start select, will not reset the RNG and cannot be used as a replacement for hard restarts for manipulations. So we just learned that we need to play perfectly in order to do RNG manips. The Game Boy runs at around 60 frames per second, so do RNG manips require tons of frame perfect inputs? Yes and no. The way the game reads inputs is frame precise, but the timing of pressing buttons does not need to be frame perfect. This is because Gen 1 has a buffering system for inputs that allows us to press buttons earlier than they are needed to still be accepted frame perfectly by the game. For this section, I'm going to be using a task tool, BizHawk, to show what I mean. On the left, you'll see a log of what inputs are being performed on any given frame, and on the right, you'll see the game itself. So let's start with showing overworld actions like walking around. When you hit a direction in the overworld, your character will walk one tile in that direction, which takes around 17 frames. After these 17 frames, the game starts checking to see if you are pressing a direction, and if you are, you will continue walking in whatever direction you pressed. Otherwise, you will come to a standstill until you press the direction again. In this example, I'll show this by pressing up on frame 4000, which will cause me to walk up one tile. In each consecutive clip, I'll be pressing up for the second time later and later to show whether or not we actually take the second step. And you'll see that it's not until I press up again on frame 4017, which is 17 frames after my original up press, that the character will move another tile into the door. Even if we're one frame early on frame 4016, this will not lead to the character moving into the door. The implication of this is that all overworld movement is frame perfect. However, if you've played any Pokemon game, or even most platforming games in general, you'll know that people don't usually have to tap a direction every single time they want to walk. Instead, they hold the buttons down. In these examples, you'll notice that I enter the house on the exact same frame, noted by the frames marked in red between 4066 and 4071, whether I'm holding the direction or pressing it frame perfectly. Also, it doesn't really matter if I start holding up immediately after the first press, or in the middle of the 17 frames, or toward the end, As long as I'm pressing it by the time the game checks for it on frame 4017, I'll be able to walk frame perfectly into the door. So when people talk about buffering movement, it means that as soon as you begin walking in the direction you pressed, you can immediately start pressing and holding the very next direction you want to go, and the game will read that input as if you did it frame perfectly. This means that you effectively have a 17 frame window in order to do frame perfect movement in the overworld. This is around 1/3 of a second, which might not sound like a lot of time, but once you start experimenting with walking around and playing the game, you'll realize that it's pretty trivial to walk around perfectly without stopping. The reason I'm spending so much time talking about this is because this is the basis of all manips in the overworld. All manips need to have fully perfect movement, and what this normally looks like is the player is holding a direction at all times. As soon as they start loading into the overworld, you start holding the very first direction you need to go, and start buffering each subsequent direction from there. If you take any pauses at all, or the movement is not perfect, the RNG will not match the manip, and you will most likely not get the expected manipulated outcome. There are a few important factors that can affect a manip working that can happen even before you start the actual manip. The three things I want to mention in this section are that trainers and items you interact with can affect manips, you cannot load any extra sprites, and whether or not you buffer or unbuffer your save can be very important. The main thing is that the map has to be in a very specific state. What I mean by this is that unless specifically mentioned by the manip saying this works, you can't fight any extra trainers or pick up any extra items on the map that you're doing the manip on. Doing these will likely mean your manip will fail unless you specifically have confirmation that it will not affect the manips. Some common examples of this are fighting an extra trainer on Route 3 before doing a manip that starts on Route 3, or picking up an extra item in Viridian Forest before doing a manip that starts in Viridian Forest. The second important factor is loading sprites before the manip starts. What does it mean to load a sprite, and what is a sprite? In Gen 1, the relevant sprites for manips are usually item balls and NPCs. When I say load a sprite, that means they are visible on your screen. The very first time you enter a map, all sprites are automatically deloaded, and as soon as they appear on your screen for the first time, they are loaded into memory. Manips assume that certain sprites will be loaded or deloaded already, so if you load a sprite when you aren't supposed to, and then try to save and perform the manip, your manip will most likely fail. One very common example of this is the yellow Nidoran manip and this item ball. If you accidentally walk too far, then walk back to the save tile and try to save and do the manip will most likely fail. This is because when you walk too far, you're loading the item ball when the manip expects the item ball to not be loaded, and that affects the manip working. Another example is with the Route 3 Moon manip in red. If you accidentally walk too far to the right and load the Jigglypuff last on Route 3 before you start the manip will not work for the same exact reason. The easiest way to fix this is to exit and enter the map again without loading the extra sprites. For the yellow red Nido manip, the fastest way to do this is to enter the gatehouse up top toward Viridian Forest, then exit and walk down around the left side of the grass to avoid loading the item balls. For the Route 3 manip example, if you accidentally loaded the last, you would have to walk all the way back to Pewter and then re-enter Route 3 and go back to the correct save tile without loading the last, and the manip should work. The third point is more relevant for Pokemon Yellow than for Red, but how you actually open your menu to start saving can make a difference in manip outcomes. Buffered saves refer to whether or not you buffer the start press to begin saving. So a buffered save is when you buffer the start press as you walk onto the tile and then save, versus an unbuffered save is when you finish walking onto the step and then press start to open your menu. The easiest way to tell whether or not you properly buffered or unbuffered a save is if you reload that save into the game and don't press a direction, an unbuffered save will always be facing down, while a buffered save will face whatever direction you were previously facing while you saved. Again, this is really more relevant for yellow than red, and yellow manips should always specify what kind of save, buffered or unbuffered. But if you're ever not sure for a red manip, it's always safer to try to buffer your save and try it that way. I'm going to separate red and yellow here because the two intros are going to be cleared differently. Starting with red, we're going to start with BIOS strategies. Whenever you hard restart your game, you should be first met with the Game Boy logo. This is referred to the BIOS screen and will automatically clear itself, but there are some strategies we can do to impact the RNG on this screen. Manips in red should mention what BIOS strategy they are using, but if it does not, you should either ask someone who knows the manip or assume that there is no BIOS strategy needed. I won't be going over all the BIOS strategies, but I'll be going over the main one used in the current glitchless manips. Also, for the following BIOS strategies that involve holding an input, the input should start being held immediately after the hard restart before the BIOS screen appears. For no PAL, this one is easy. This is just doing nothing on the BIOS screen. If the BIOS strategy is not mentioned, assume it is no PAL and make sure you don't press the button during this screen. No PAL AB can be performed by pressing A or B or start or select and then holding it until the copyright screen. PAL hold is when you start holding a direction, optionally with A or B added, and hold the inputs until the copyright screen. And PAL is when you start holding a direction, again optionally with A or B added, but you want to let go as soon as you see the palette of your Game Boy switch. The key thing here is that the inputs you press during the BIOS do matter, so please be conscious of it and don't randomly press buttons for no reason. You'll also want to pay attention when you're learning a manip for what BIOS strategy is needed and make sure you're doing the same thing that is required from the manip. Continuing from there, the most standard way to proceed through the intro is to start holding up plus B plus select once you hit the copyright screen, and you want to hold all three of these inputs until you see the title screen. From the title screen, you want to start holding the start button until you begin entering the new game continue option screen, and then you want to hold A until you start entering the overworld. For yellow, it's a little bit simpler, as there's no BIOS strats needed. I'm going to go over the main intro strategy used for all yellow manips in the current any% glitchless routes. There are other ways to clear this intro, but they are pretty niche and not used too often. First, you want to wait until the copyright screen, and then you want to begin holding the start button. After you see or hear the Game Freak logo flash, you want to start holding A. After you reach the title screen, you want to start holding start again. And then once the title screen is cleared, you want to start holding A through the new game continue option screen until you start entering the overworld. As soon as you start loading into the game, you should start holding your first movement input for the manip path. As mentioned in section 1, you're going to have to play perfectly to manipulate RNG, so you can't take any pauses or hesitate in your movement. An earlier section covered how to do perfect movement, but manips introduce A presses as well. On a manip map, these are usually notated by tiles marked in green. An A press is registered by having the A button held down by the time you finish walking onto a target tile. You can begin pressing the A button as soon as you start walking onto the tile, meaning that you have a 17 frame window to start pressing A and hold it through the rest of your walk animation, which is the same as regular movement buffering described in section 2. After the A press is registered on a tile, it doesn't matter too much when you release the A button as long as it's before the next A button press is required. The most common mistake I see people make is not holding the A button long enough for the game to register it. Again, the goal of A presses is not tap A while you are on this tile, but instead have the A button held down as you finish walking onto the tile. I find that a good way to practice this is to try buffering an A press to talk to signs. You can walk up to a sign and start holding A as you approach it, and if you talk to the sign without bonking, you did it correctly. Otherwise, you missed the window. Practice makes perfect, but once you figure out the timing of A presses and start practicing movement with A presses, learning manips will become much easier. Another thing to note is that whenever you pick up an item as part of a manip, and this is especially relevant for moon manips, whenever you press A to pick up an item, you want to hold that A press until the text finishes printing. A decent cue for this is to hold A until you start hearing the item jingle. If you don't do this, there's a small chance that the manip will fail, so you should get in the habit of doing this for every item pickup you do in a manip. I'm only going to touch on this subject briefly, but even if you do everything perfectly, all manips have some chance of failing. That's because when you save, the game stores the in-game time as part of the saved data, and it stores the current time as hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. The frame you save on can affect the RNGs slightly. Most manips are designed to work on as many of these IGT frames as possible. The modern manips should have their IGT information posted with actual maps and paths. Normally it's expressed as a fraction out of 60 or sometimes a fraction out of 3600. If it's out of 60, that means it's tested on all 60 IGT frames, whereas out of 3600 means that it's tested on all 60 seconds for every 60 frame per second, so 60 times 60 being 3600. If you're failing a manip but you feel like you're doing everything properly, you might be getting one of these IGT failures. Manips should have a list of the most common IGT failures, so if it matches up with the result that you're seeing, the remedy is to try to resave and get a different IGT, and hopefully the next frame will work. If after everything here you're still not getting the manip successfully and you're not sure what you're doing wrong, the easiest and fastest way for you to receive help for anything manip related is to record a video of yourself doing the manip with an input display and post it on the Gen 1 through 3 PSR Discord. As reviewed here, there's many factors that go into doing a manip successfully, and the easiest way to debug and troubleshoot is to have a video with inputs so that people can precisely know what's going on. Especially as someone learning a manip for the first time, you might not fully understand what you're doing wrong, and trying to communicate that with text only can be very frustrating for both sides. The amount of times I've seen a manip issue instantly solved by posting a video cannot be understated, and I would highly recommend joining the Gen 1 through 3 PSR Discord, linked in the description if you need help. Anyway, that's all for this video. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching.